this, it was at least taught to me in school. I don't know to what extent it's widespread, but the greenhouse effect, for those of you who are maybe not so familiar, is the fundamental cause of climate change, of global warming. It's certainly the most drastic cause by far. And what happens is the sun shines light onto the earth. It passes through our atmosphere in all sorts of wavelengths, all sorts of colors. The earth then absorbs that light and, produces heat and this kind of thing from that light. But then a lot of the light is passed back into space. A lot of it just bounces off. It doesn't necessarily bounce off like the same color, if you will, as it was absorbed. A lot of the time we're taking in say visible light, and then the earth is reflecting out infrared light. That infrared light is trapped by our atmosphere to a greater or lesser extent and bounced back at us by our atmosphere. And the more the atmosphere bounces back that energy from the sun, the more that energy warms the earth and the hotter things get. So it then follows that the more reflective our atmosphere, the more the atmosphere is blanketing the earth like this, the hotter it gets, the more of the sun's energy we trap. And that's what carbon dioxide is doing. That's what methane is doing to an even greater degree, considerably greater degree, just on a different time scale. So that's the greenhouse effect. That's what we're fundamentally trying to avoid altering as much as we are. In terms of the scientific understanding of to what extent climate change is a man-made issue, it has for many years been understood that 100% of global heating, that's the change in temperature relative to, say, 1850, at least since 1950, 100% of it is caused by human activity. There was a study as well. There was a scientific paper released in, when was it? I think it was early 2019, that studied 11,000 papers, every scientific research paper that the authors could find on the subject of climate change, which turned out to be 11,000, and analyzed how many of them say humans caused climate change and how many of them say they didn't. 11,000 said that they did, 0 said that they didn't. The scientific consensus has reached 100% now that it's no longer so fashionable for fossil fuel companies to fund false climate studies. Those supposed counter voices disappeared. So where are we at with this? Basically, this lovely graph is the history of the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. How much CO2 is there in the atmosphere? And you can see that for last 1800 years, it stayed fairly steady, around 280 parts per million, 280, whichever. But since the industrial age, around 1800, specifically about, about 1850, where we have this sudden uptick, the CO2 concentration started to really that's right. The CO2 concentration started to really uptick. And then at the same time, exactly in tandem, which is what the science tells us to expect, the temperature started to uptick. This is what's known as the hockey stick graph. It's this sudden, really enormous leap in temperature and in CO2 caused by us, caused by the industrial age. We're already approaching the 1.2 degrees C level now, which for anyone familiar with what different temperatures might mean for us as a species and as co-inhabitants of the planet, it's not good. 2 degrees C is where we're heading. Almost definitely, even if we pull out all of the stops. Hopefully not above 2 degrees. That's still open to us. but 2 degrees is still the warmest the Earth would have been in 130,000 years. And 4 degrees C, which is still on the cards if we don't have major scale political action to avoid climate change. 4 degrees C is the warmest it's been would be the warmest it had been for several million years. The difference between 4 degrees C and 2 degrees C was summed up fairly well by one of the world's leading climate scientists who works out in Sydney, I think it is, in Australia. In it was 2017, he said that the difference between 2 degrees C and 4 degrees C of warming is simple. It's human civilization. At 4 degrees C of warming, the effect across the entire world of all of our support systems shutting down in sort of localized areas at first and then spreading, the effect is going to be beyond our wildest imaginings, and is definitely the main thing that we want to avoid as a species. But where are we at the moment in terms of the effects of climate change? We can sometimes come across the issue with climate change where, because it's so severe in its effects, say in the future, say 2050 or 2100, people can get stuck on talking about those, distant times, or maybe talking about the effect in the third world or the global south. But really, the effects of climate change are very much here and very much now. And already, the changes that have been brought about in the world are not good. In terms of drought, this is a map of the likelihood of drought across the world. Global warming has been contributing to droughts since at least 1900, and the more we warm, the more the effects will grow. The more droughts there'll be, and the more severe that they'll be. Sorry, at this point, I'm going to start to read the show notes a little bit more. So there was a drought in Cape Town quite recently that led to water shortages, and that was made 3 times more likely by global warming. Droughts of that scale are made far more likely by the global warming that we've already had. In terms of storms, we have the problem both of not enough water and of too much. The main thing to understand with climate change is in that word change. What we take for granted in terms of the way our weather systems are going to work, it's just not going to be like that anymore, and in ways that are very difficult to predict. So we'll have we'll be without water in some places and be experiencing extreme storms in others. And one of the things with storms is that when we're introducing energy, when we're introducing heat into the atmosphere, that energy can take different forms. It can simply warm the air, but also as we warm the air, it becomes more energetic. And one of the consequences of that is far more intense, far more frequent, far more severe storms. We're already seeing like a big effect of climate change in the frequency and the extent of hurricanes and storms affecting the United States, for example. Also, I don't need to tell you about the fires that happened in California and Australia, particularly over the last year and a half or so. It's the news has spoken for itself really over the last couple of years. But when you're looking at 3 billion animals dying in the space of just a couple of months, it's extraordinary what these are capable of. I would also mention as well that even the UK had a record year for wildfires in 2018. It's again already at this level of warming. we also have, again, hot, cold, we have sea level rise. And, this is something that we've been hearing about for many years as the ice caps melt and this kind of thing. But sea level rise isn't just necessarily a threat to those on the coast, although of course it has the power to wipe out island nations and island cities. It's also a threat in terms of increasing the likelihood of floods inland. And this is the kind of thing that we're going to see a lot of in the UK. So moving on to the UK, a bit more heat can sound like a good thing naively, but another general principle of climate change is that if we experience, say, an average increase of 2 degrees C across the world, in individual places that increase will be greater and it will be lesser. But what will increase far more is the extremes that we experience. So although we're already, experiencing some temperatures that the UK has never seen on a year-by-year basis, every time we see new temperatures that the UK has never seen, in terms of an individual hottest day that, say, has the power to kill potentially thousands of people with heat stroke, the likelihood of these events are skyrocketing as climate change brings about changes in the extremes that we experience. Flooding as well is, I lost that slide, there we go. Flooding as well is going to be a major factor for the UK. There's a map that I can link to if people are interested that shows where the projected places that are going to have yearly flooding, like every single year, are for the UK, and it's by 2050, and it's a significant portion of the UK's landmass. This is going to be one of the major ways that we see climate change, and we're already seeing climate change in the UK. You may recognise this this picture of Fairborn in North Wales, the village that's been decommissioned is the term by the I think it's the local government, who can't afford the flood defences for this low-lying village anymore, so they've just written it off. It's too expensive to counter this. And this same experience of the sea rising, floods becoming an annual thing, it's not just happening in the UK, of course. This is happening across the world. So onto the hard bit to talk about, and this is the part of it that actually got me into Extinction Rebellion, and this is the bit we understand the least as scientists. So it's not actually, for example, in the IPCC reports, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's not in their reports because it's too new and it's too poorly understood in terms of what exactly it looks like. But what's incontrovertible is that this is happening. And this is the idea of what we call tipping points. And you may be familiar already with the idea of a feedback loop, like when you say get a you get a microphone too close to a speaker, and a small sound is picked up by the speaker and then amplified by the mic, and amplified by the speaker, and then picked up louder by the mic and amplified louder by the speaker, and you get this feedback effect where something builds and builds. There are, I think it's something like 14 different climate feedback loops that scientists have identified, and there may well be more, where our heating caused by us incontrovertibly, that we can to some extent control, kickstarts a natural process or a process from nature of an enormously larger scale, where some natural process breaks down and itself either releases CO2 or prevents the absorption of CO2 from our atmosphere from nature that we take for granted. And that would then, of course, cause the temperature to rise further. And these feedback loops We don't know when they're going to start. Some of them have already started and are already contributing, but this may well be what might spiral climate change completely out of the hands of control of humans, up to 4 degrees, up to 6 degrees, maybe up to 8 degrees. These are all temperatures that have been suggested being possible if feedback loops start. And to give context, 6 degrees in the book, 6 degrees of, our final warning, 6 degrees of climate emergency by Mark Linus, sums up the research on climate change. He says that at 6 degrees of warming, average warming across the world, the Earth will no longer be capable of sustaining biological life. That's not just the extinction of the human race. That's the extinction of biological life on the Earth. This is, you know, the summary of peer-reviewed science. This is what we're looking at if the feedback loops are triggered. We're still far off that, but it's still on the horizon, again, if action isn't taken. One feedback loop, just to illustrate this, is probably a relatively familiar one again. I think I was taught this in school, where as temperatures rise over the Arctic in particular, the ice melts. But when the bright ice melts and leaves dark water in its place, that dark water absorbs more sunlight than the ice. The ice is, you know, it's very reflective, and the sun is bounced off, whereas the dark water is going to absorb more heat and melt more ice. And this is a feedback loop. And another particularly, the one that, you know, I've lost sleep over is the Amazon, but trees in general. The Amazon in particular, as the temperature warms in the Amazon, the, you know, precisely balanced ecosystems start to break down, and their ability to actually, you know, go on in the way that they've gone on, with the trees growing and absorbing carbon dioxide, the soils taking in carbon dioxide from the roots, this whole system working to be the lungs of the earth, that starts to break down. The trees start to die, and carbon dioxide is then given off by the decaying trees. This is already happening in parts of the Amazon. And in general, trees in general don't like the increase in carbon dioxide and don't like the increase in temperatures. I'm in danger of going off topic, but what's happening to trees is not good. I'll leave it at that. So this graph is quite difficult to understand at face value, but what it shows, and I think it's the last graph, what it shows is our yearly emissions of CO2. And, you know, we've had this drastic ramp up over the last 40 years, you know, since we found out that climate change was the thing. And each of these lines represent how much CO2 we would have to emit, or how much we would be allowed to emit to stay below 1.5 degrees of total heating, which is still going to drastically disrupt the Earth and our life support systems, but, you know, is the least bad scenario that people talk about. But you can see that the later we leave it, and, you know, here we are, this black line with if we acted today, the later we leave it before actually taking action on climate change, the steeper this drop has to be. And this is our yearly emissions of carbon dioxide. So say right now, in order to meet that 1.5 degrees of warming, we would have to be cutting our emissions by something like 7 to 8% every year for the next, I don't know how many years that is, something like 25 years. If we wait 5 years before acting, then it's got to be even steeper still, because we've emitted more carbon, we've emitted more carbon and warmed the Earth more. And we then have less to play with. We have less time to act. By 2025, it would then have to be something like 15 to 16% a year that would have to cut emissions. So this is why it's so absolutely critical that it's now that we act. This is why Extinction Rebellion are always saying, act now. It's because the scientists are showing us we don't have time. We don't have time to mess around. So that's the climate side. I'm running out of time, but I will touch on the ecological side as well. Essentially, the issue with climate change is that it's quite easy to talk about it in terms of like, oh, the world is warming by this much. Maybe we'll have more storms, we'll have more droughts. But what you don't get from that picture of things is this understanding that the world that supports us, that produces our oxygen, produces our food, produces our water, is a very finely balanced system. And as the climate warms, we're at incredible risk of completely disrupting that life support system. We're already doing it in all sorts of ways in terms of the use of land. And 80% of farmland providing just 18% of our calories in terms of meat. Things like this, where we end up completely transforming the way that the land has been for millennia, the balances that have built up. When we take things so far out of balance, we're at risk of them completely collapsing. This is, in fact, what we're facing, or what we would face if we don't act. I touched on this with the Amazon example, but one of the examples is how if you cut down trees and disrupt the natural ecosystems, you can end up with every form of life that would be sucking in carbon, would be sinking our carbon emissions and helping us. They all die. They all then start to release carbon, and you're left with a desert where nothing can survive. And it's then drastically harder to plant the seeds of reforestation there again. Once you've lost it, it's really, really difficult to bring it back. The oceans as well are another of these sort of poorly understood aspects of this. There's what's happening with the ocean is that the top layer is warming quite a lot, whereas of course it's warming less downstream below or below the top layer, and as the air warms due to human activity. But what that does is it disrupts the natural mechanisms for ocean currents. Ocean currents, which is how most of our weather is formed, from the large scale movement of ocean currents across the entire world, bringing cold water and therefore cold air from, say, the north and south, and then warmer water bringing warmer air from the equator back up. All of these ocean currents rely on the ocean having a structure in terms of temperature that it's accustomed to. And as we're warming that top layer, like warm things rise, right? And as we're warming that top layer, it becomes less likely to then sink down and start this process of ocean currents. I've not explained that very well, but the fundamental thing is that we're disrupting the way that the ocean works as an entire system that causes our entire weather. We've already demonstrated, or scientists have already demonstrated, that the currents in the Arctic Ocean have slowed down by 15% already by the influence of human activity. And as that temperature rises and rises, they're at risk of stopping altogether. if the Arctic current stops, which it's very likely to this century, again, if things go on as they are, this would cause such a drastic change in the weather that the UK is proposed by researchers to become then unable to support large-scale farming of any description. We become completely unable to grow our own food. And this is happening at the same time, of course, as all of the droughts, the storms, everything that otherwise threatens our food. But of course, there's also the loss of the natural habitats of creatures to contend with. We have 40% of species of insect being proposed to be in line for extinction within the next few decades. And this is the 1 million species at risk figure that you may have come across in the news. We have no clue what knock-on effects of the entire ecosystems that these insects are part of collapsing would have. We know for sure that many of those species are going to be pollinators, actually causing our food to be produced, pollinating our crops. But who knows what else the knock-on effects will be. So hopefully that's given a bit of an impression of how climate change is the defining issue of our time, and we're at a defining moment, as Antonio Guterres, the UN General Secretary, Secretary General, said. So, this image very nicely shows. From this moment, despair ends and tactics begin. This is where XR come in. Fundamentally, this entire problem is driven by CO2, also by methane, mostly from the natural gas industry and from animal agriculture. But CO2 really, that's the big one. How do we get rid of CO2? Is it by holding climate conferences and agreeing on protocols? This graph would argue it's not. Every stage over the last, 30 years, where the countries of the world have come together and the politicians have agreed to do something about it, or at least to set a goal, they have completely failed to stop this relentless upwards trajectory of the CO2 concentration. Why hasn't it worked? Ultimately, elections lead to short-termism. The politician always has to look out for themselves. They can't implement anything too drastic, they feel, or they won't be elected next time. And then the other guys will get in. Growth is valued above everything else. This is the capitalist society that we unfortunately currently live in. And competition is valued above cooperation. It's not hard to see that in the ethics of this government, as they have to be, oh, we're the world leader in such and such every single time, and then completely fail to follow through. When you value competition above everything else, everything seems to fall apart a little bit. And ultimately, the approach is when the rules don't work, when politicians have shown that they are unable to meet this existential crisis, this threat that is beyond our imagining. For the most part, most of us, even in Extinction Rebellion, can't think about how quite really fucking bad this is a lot of the time. But when you do, you realize quite how far we might have to go to bring about the change that we need. And it's by no means a new thing to break the rules to bring about change. So here we have Gandhi, who's one of the one of the fathers really of this idea of non-violent direct action. That's Extinction Rebellion's term for this sort of peaceful rebellion that we do. We have, of course, Rosa Parks as well, and Martin Luther King. All of these people took some of the same approaches that Extinction Rebellion do now, all of them vilified at the time, but now seen as very much on the right side of history. So I'm not going to talk a huge amount about Extinction Rebellion today, especially given I've already gone over time. But we have three demands, fundamentally, to tell the truth. Listen to scientists, listen to the climate scientists. You know, we don't need any more climate science at this point. We know what's going on. But the government and the media don't talk about it as if it's true. They don't popularize the idea. There's very poor education on what we're facing. You know, I had to do it for some reason. We want to act now for reasons that hopefully are fairly clear in that graph for quite how drastically bad it is to delay huge scale action on climate change. And finally, we have this idea of being beyond politics. And the primary mechanism for that, of uniting people, whatever their political persuasion, is the Citizens' Assembly. So the Citizens' Assembly is a way of electing, not electing, sorry. Let me read the actual text here briefly. We're very near the end. Yeah, I'm just going to read the speaker's notes for this because I don't know a huge amount about the Citizens' Assemblies. Our political system as it stands is incapable of making complex decisions, such as those presented by the climate emergency. Party politics and the focus on the next election make it difficult, if not impossible, for politicians to take a long-term view. Because a Citizens' Assembly has people who come from all walks of life, research shows that what they decide is more accepted by the public. People know someone like me was on the assembly and so more easily accept their decision. The decisions they make are usually better because members, unlike politicians, are not worrying about their career, whether they'll get re-elected or what the press will say. They're not getting a distorted view from wealthy donors, lobbyists, or being from only privileged backgrounds. So a Citizens' Assembly is a way of strengthening our democracy. And just to say, I guess it was on the previous slide in the notes, a Citizens' Assembly is where random members of the country are picked, educated about the issues that we're facing, and over a lengthy period of time, you know, shown the facts and then allowed to debate and discuss and arrive at actionable conclusions about what we should do as a result. And what Extinction Rebellion demands is that we produce a Citizens' Assembly with legislative power, with the ability to go above government and their careers and their corruption and legislate for this incredibly difficult issue and bring about change. So it was explained on this slide. Apologies for that. It's the bit that I don't know hugely well.
Thank you very much, Louis. Could I possibly interrupt? And
yeah, absolutely.
That's been an absolutely fantastic presentation. Absolutely shocking facts. And it's certainly given me, and I'm sure everybody else, the desire to get on and do something. And it'd be really great to hear now from Caroline